The American Dream Dusty Rhodes was one of the most innovative and creative bookers in the history of the wrestling business. Sure, Dusty's ideas could sometimes miss the mark too, but there isn't a booker out there with a perfect track record. Something Dusty should also be credited for was his desire to innovate. We hear a lot about how Dusty would help superstars reach the next level and how he influenced so many people. But Dusty also helped the wrestling business itself through his own creativity. Cornerstone WCW events such as Starrcade and the Great American Bash, those very names that are still used today, with contention of course, those were Dusty Rhodes' creations. The Lethal Lottery and Battle Bowl concepts were also Dusty's creations, and really the whole tone of Crockett Promotions, the no-nonsense style of professional wrestling, a lot of this was due to the decisions that Dusty Rhodes made as a booker. One of Dusty's most innovative ideas was the War Games match, a double-ring steel cage bout that gave us some of the NWA's most violent showdowns. Just the side of the two rings surrounded by the steel cage was awe-inspiring, and in the early days there was an expectation that the War Games match would give fans unfiltered brutality, and because of the way the War Games match was laid out with staggered entrance, the physicality and excitement would build and build and build until finally the second part of War Games began, known as the Match Beyond. Today's video looks at one of Dusty Rhodes' finest creations. This is the War Games match. So we've already established that without Dusty Rhodes there wouldn't be War Games, but what gave Dusty the idea to create the match type? Well, we have the Four Horsemen to thank also. If the Horsemen didn't exist, then War Games wouldn't exist either. Dusty was in the middle of his storied rivalry with Ric Flair, and Dusty needed a new match that could include all members of the Horsemen taking on Dusty Rhodes and a group of babyfaces. Dusty got inspiration after a trip to the cinema, and after seeing the movie Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, a light bulb went off and Dusty thought that a giant cage that surrounded two rings would not only provide the ultimate battleground for Rhodes and the Horsemen, but it would also look like an incredible spectacle. The visual of War Games was just as important as the match itself. Dusty said, "I was looking for some sort of creative out. I was getting beat up by the Four Horsemen, 5 if you count JJ Dillon, and I had different partners and we were fighting this war. I had just come from seeing Tina Turner and Mel Gibson in the Thunderdome. I see this cage and I see the top on the cage. Through the years in our industry, the cage match has always been a big thing, especially down south where you blew off matches. So I said, has there ever been 2 rings with a cage? One cage covering both rings with a top on it, 2 doors at each end, and 2 teams of 5? So Dusty saw the Thunderdome in Mad Max 2 and he got the idea to surround 2 wrestling rings with one giant cage. 2 doors would be at either side of the cage, a door for each team competing in War Games. Before we look at the initial rules of the War Games match, we should also look into how this thing got built. Back then, a standard cage would take a pretty long time to set up in the ring. The crew would bring cage panels down to the ring and the audience in attendance would have to sit and wait while the cage was being built. This really wasn't an option for War Games, so Dusty had the idea of suspending the cage above the ring, and when it was time for War Games, the cage would get lowered. In modern wrestling, this is standard practice, of course. Many wrestling fans wouldn't know the name Klondike Bill. Bill was trained in Stu Hart's dungeon and he competed in Stampede Wrestling and various other territories during the 60s right up until the early 80s. Before I continue on, you simply need to read up on Klondike Bill stories or listen to Tony Schiavone tell Klondike Bill stories on his podcast. His escapades are extremely fascinating to say the least. Anyway, Klondike Bill was eventually hired by Jim Crockett to build guardrails, wrestling rings, and, of course, steel cages. Klondike Bill was the man who built the War Games cage, and Dusty Rhodes said that Bill thought the American Dream had lost his mind when discussing the idea. Dusty said, "I got a white sheet of paper and I used the light of my car. I kinda drew an outline of the way I wanted the War Games to look and the way the cage was. I knew Klondike would be back at the office in Charlotte, so I go there. By the time I get there, I'm pretty roaring. I've got this idea and I don't want to wait until the morning. I lay it out to Klondike on the street in the parking lot. I'm on my knees with a flashlight and I show him what I want built. I've got the okay from Crockett Promotions and Crockett is standing right there. So Klondike, you can build this thing. He says, where is it going to go? I say, it's going to hang above the ring and it's going to drop down. He thought I was completely nuts. Old Klondike worked on it like a mad scientist. I saw him welding the cage and I thought, there it is, it's coming to life. Dusty also revealed that a concern about the first War Games match would be the removal of front row seats. In order for the cage to fit around the ring, the first row would get removed, and there was a concern here about losing money. It was decided that the seats closest to the War Games would get raised in price. Dusty was confident that people would want to see this new match, and he had no concerns about charging people extra to see it up close and personal. He was absolutely right, by the way. The Omni in Atlanta was sold out on July 4th, 1987, the date of the very first War Games match. So the structure was now getting put together and the War Games cage was becoming a reality. Dusty now had to work out how the match would play out. What are the rules? How does a team win? How do you book a new concept that both makes sense and entertains the fans in attendance? Again, Dusty took some inspiration from outside sources. Dusty said he was watching a hockey game and he took note of the penalty box. A player gets sent to the box and this makes the match uneven. Dusty had the idea of flipping and reversing this rule. The first part of War Games would be uneven. It would be about one team having an unfair advantage until every man was in the cage. A man from each team would start the match, and after a set period of time, a coin toss would decide who comes in next. This meant that until the next competitor came in, there would be a 2-on-1 advantage. This would continue throughout the match, so there would also eventually be a 3-on-2 advantage, a 4-on-3 advantage, and a 5-on-4 advantage. One of the main gripes people have with War Games then is that the heels would usually maintain the advantage throughout the first half of the match, but it is what it is. When all competitors are in the cage, then the second half of the bout would begin, known as the match beyond. The winner of War Games could only be decided in the match beyond, and victory was gained by submission or surrender. There were no pinfalls. As soon as one person gave up, then that person's whole team would lose the match. With its unique set of rules and the visual of War Games itself, the match type became an instant hit. War Games was like nothing fans had ever seen before. The rules of War Games would change too over the years, but we'll look into this a little bit later. Okay, so let's take a little time to look at the very first War Games match so we can see how Dusty's vision translated to TV. On the Four Horsemen side, we have Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Lex Luger and JJ Dillon. The Horsemen will be facing the team of Dusty Rhodes and Nikita Koloff, together known as the Superpowers, along with the Road Warriors and Paul Ellering. The babyface squad collectively was known as the Dream Team. The first War Games match was part of the 1987 Great American Bash Tour held inside the Omni Coliseum in Atlanta. Fans had already seen superstars like the Rock and Roll Express, the Freebirds, the Midnight Express, Barry Windham and Steve Williams before the main event even took place. The main story has already been explained. This was all about Dusty Rhodes trying to get revenge on the Four Horsemen. The Horsemen wouldn't have a numbers advantage this time when the match beyond began. The cage gets lowered as the ring announcer declares, "Let the War Games begin." Ric Flair's theme music plays and out walk the Four Horsemen along with JJ Dillon. The Horsemen congregate at one of the cage doors and then out walks Rhodes, Koloff, Hawk Animal and Ellering. The ring announcer goes over the rules. The first two competitors will square off for 5 minutes and then a coin toss decides the next entrant. Then there'll be 2 minutes in between new competitors entering the match. Our two superstars who start off the very first War Games are the American Dream Dusty Rhodes and the Enforcer Arn Anderson. The commentary team remind us that this is going to be a 5-minute fight and nothing more. The match can't be decided until all 10 men are in the ring. Dream takes the early advantage and he goes from one ring to another, establishing here that nothing is off limits within the confines of the cage. Dusty then uses the cage ceiling to his advantage and he also hits a low blow on Double A. Again, all of this was done to establish that anything goes during a War Games match. The Enforcer can't catch a break against the American Dream. A DDT leads to Anderson getting busted open, and Rhodes capitalizes by grinding Arn's head against the cage ceiling before ramming Arn's head into a cage panel. The destruction of Anderson continues. Dusty locks in a figure 4 as the ring announcer says we have 15 seconds until the next competitor enters the match. A coin toss is held outside the rings and it favours the Horsemen. Tully Blanchard is so excited to get into the match that he almost falls into the ring. Arn and Tully initially beat down Dusty, but the roof nearly comes off the arena when Dream fights back. Honestly, the crowd noise during this whole match is absolutely phenomenal. Dusty can't maintain the upper hand, he ends up getting busted open after some hard shots from Anderson, and Tully locks in a figure 4 while Double A holds Dream down. Rhodes has to endure 2 minutes of torture before a teammate comes in, and when Road Warrior Animal gets into the match, the crowd again explodes. Animal destroys Tully and Arn, and now we have an even playing field as Animal focuses on Tully and Dusty goes after Double A. Eventually Tully finds himself getting decimated by Rhodes and Animal. Arn tries to save his partner, but it's no use. The Horsemen then get a 3-on-2 advantage when the Nature Boy Ric Flair comes into the match. Animal and Rhodes take a beating here, and while there are glimmers of hope, for the most part the Horsemen are in control. Nikita Koloff is in next, and the Horsemen try to take Nikita out the moment he gets into the ring, but a thunderous double clothesline stops Flair and Anderson in their tracks. It's absolute chaos as the babyfaces begin leading the match once again. Jim Ross has to scream into his headset because the audience is so loud, and I know I've said this already, but it really can't get put over enough. This is one of the loudest matches you'll ever watch, and the audience makes it more special. Koloff then wrecks everything in sight. We see a double dropkick from Dusty and Road Warrior Animal before the next competitor comes in. It's the total package Lex Luger. Luger hits a power slam on Koloff, and a low blow from the Nature Boy completely kills Nikita's momentum. Nikita also takes not one but 2 spike pile drivers from the Nature Boy and Tully Blanchard as Road Warrior Hawk gets ready to come into the match. When the second Road Warrior enters War Games, he's truly a one-man wrecking machine. Hawk just runs in there and he takes out everybody. His intensity was completely off the charts here. Ric Flair manages to put Dusty in the figure 4, but remember, the match could still not end until Dillon and Paul Ellering entered the match. JJ comes into War Games and he makes the mistake of going after Road Warrior Hawk. Flair makes the save, but the Nature Boy pays the price by getting his head grinded into the steel cage. Dillon doesn't help the Horsemen too much by the time Paul Ellering comes into the cage, and now the match beyond begins. Every man is now inside War Games, and the match can only end via submission. Well, submission or surrender, as the match was billed. Dillon gets busted open badly. Ellering uses a spike from his ring gear to open Dillon up even more, and then the Road Warriors perform a modified Doomsday device that legitimately left Dillon with a dislocated shoulder that required surgery. Hawk begins choking JJ with his foot, and Dillon has no other choice but to give it up. The Horsemen lose. Dusty Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, the Road Warriors and Paul Ellering win the very first War Games match. The first ever War Games was an incredible success with a reported $250,000 gate, and remember, this was in 1987 and this wasn't in New York. So successful was the first War Games concept that a second match was booked later in the month, around 3 weeks after the original. Held in the Miami Orange Bowl, War Games 2 featured the exact same dream team of Rhodes, Koloff, Ellering and the Road Warriors, but because of the injuries sustained in the first match, Dillon was replaced by War Machine over on the Horsemen's side. Who was the War Machine? Well, it was none other than Big Bubba Rogers, or the Big Boss Man, whichever you prefer. We have nothing but time here, so let's take a quick look at the second War Games match before wrapping things up. War Games 2 was similar to the first match from a planning perspective. The match again started off with Anderson and Rhodes, and their in-ring routine pretty much matches what they did in the Omni. The big difference here with War Games 2 was the venue. It's an outdoor stadium, so War Games was getting exposed to a larger audience. Double A gets busted open within seconds of the match starting. We see the DDT spot again, Anderson gets his face rubbed into the cage again, and Dream locks in the figure 4 again to get the crowd pumped up. The heels once again win the coin toss and War Machine comes into the match, and the heels do a number on Rhodes. Dream gets busted open as the audience waits for help to arrive. Road Warrior Hawk is in next and he cleans house. Then Ric Flair comes in to give the Horsemen an advantage. War Machine, Anderson and Flair are firmly in the driver's seat until Nikita Koloff comes in. Nikita brings a ton of fire, and then it's Tully Blanchard's turn to step into War Games. Road Warrior Animal gets in and he repeatedly drills Tully's head into the cage. You can see Tully bleeding here, by the way. And then Lex Luger comes into the match. There's a great moment here where Animal tosses Tully from one ring to the other, completely launching the Horsemen over 2 sets of ring ropes. And then Paul Ellering comes in to begin the match beyond. Again, Ellering uses his spiked armband to gain an advantage. War Games 2 comes to an end when War Machine takes multiple clotheslines from multiple opponents. Road Warrior Animal then uses Ellering's armband and he drills the spike repeatedly into War Machine's eye. War Machine gives up and once again the babyfaces win. From this point onwards, War Games would become a tradition of WCW. The next 13 War Games matches took place at house shows. They all took place between 1987 and 1988, and all but one featured the complete Four Horsemen lineup. The 4th War Games match saw the Midnight Express replace Flair and Luger. Another War Games match was held at the 1989 Great American Bash, and then the Wrestle War pay-per-view would become the home of War Games. Eventually, the match became a yearly tradition of the Fall Brawl pay-per-view. In 1998, WCW tried something different. War Games would become a 3-team, 9-man competition. Pinfalls were also allowed in this version of War Games, and whoever got the pin or submission for their team would earn a WCW title shot. Diamond Dallas Page won the match. There was no War Games match in 1999, but the match was revamped with War Games 2000, also known as Russo's Revenge. I won't discuss that in this video though, that's for another time, and really it was so different from the original War Games concept that it almost disgraces the original idea that Dusty Rhodes came up with way back in '87. Other companies have also produced their own spin-off of War Games, including ECW's Ultimate Jeopardy Steel Cage match, even All Elite Wrestling's proposed Blood and Guts match, which had to be postponed due to the coronavirus outbreak. That can be traced all the way back to War Games, but it's NXT who now presents official War Games matches. Well, at least official in name. The Elimination Chamber was kinda the WWE's original offshoot of War Games, but the WWE now holds a yearly War Games contest on their NXT brand. It's still very different from the original. There's no roof on the cage, although escaping would result in a forfeit. Pinfalls are also allowed, and the amount of teams and competitors that compete in NXT War Games has changed over the years. Cody Rhodes, the son of the American Dream Dusty Rhodes, has been having quite the battle trying to get the rights to his father's creations. From pay-per-view names to match concepts, he even struggled to use the Rhodes name for quite some time. But anyway, Cody publicly said that he wanted to buy the rights to War Games from the WWE. Cody argued that because it was his dad's original idea, and because NXT don't follow the traditional War Games rules, then he should be able to use the concept in AEW along with the War Games name. The WWE, of course, aren't keen on letting go of the match along with Dusty's other creations. I stay neutral in all of this really, but I will say this: if the WWE's strategy is to hold on to copyrights and concepts that they don't plan on using, then they should absolutely give them up and allow Cody to use them. I enjoy NXT War Games, but I don't enjoy them nearly as much as the original classic matches from the Crockett and WCW days. says. If Cody wants to try and recapture that magic and try to present War Games the way it was, then he should be allowed to. Hopefully when All Elite Wrestling goes ahead with their Blood and Guts match, we'll see a return to form, but we won't be seeing any kind of Blood and Guts matches for quite some time, I think. In regards to the very first War Games match, Dusty said, "It was an event. It was an event for me to watch it come to life. Anybody who creates anything, once they see it, once they feel it, once it's been yours, you touch it, you watch it, you sit back and you see it come to life. It's amazing. It's something that just comes over you for a second. It takes your breath away, man."